Welcome to another week, which I know we have been looking forward to, of Midrash on the Parashat with Rabbi Dr. Samuel Lebens. As we've been doing each week, we will continue doing this week, going through some midrashim on the Parashah to get some more depth and understanding, and it's been really great so far. So again, if you're joining us here on Zoom, I will invite you to become a panelist. You don't have to do anything, but it does give you more opportunities for participation. But if you do accept that invitation, we ask that you stay muted when you're not intending to share your audio with us, just because life can be noisy and we don't necessarily want to hear all of it during this class. But without further ado, please, Dr. Lebens.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here as ever. We are moving into Parashat Vayetze, and we're continuing in the life of Jacob. Now, part of what I want to trace with the midrashim this week and next week, because it turns out there is a class next week, is this somewhat peculiar idea that develops, really after the main midrashic collections have been compiled. This strange idea that Jacob is a symbol of truth, and in the book of Micah, it's God says, or God is besought. Micah beseeches God to give a chesed, loving kindness, to Abraham, and to give truth to Jacob. Now, you might think the reason the prophet asks God to give truth to Jacob is because if anyone's in need of some truth, it's Jacob, because there's such a deficit, seemingly, of truth in his life, because he is associated with trickery and lying. Indeed, he lied. First of all, he tricked Asaph last week into selling the rights of the firstborn, and then he tricked his father by dressing up in his father's clothing. So he's associated with. Oh, there is a source sheet. 1 second. I'll just put it into the chat. For everyone, and then Vayetze. So that for those on Zoom, you should have that handout now. So Jacob's life is associated with these episodes in last week's Parashah of deceit and treachery. So how he becomes associated with truth, perhaps when Micah the prophet says, God give truth to Jacob, he's saying, because Jacob really needs some truth. But that isn't how the Rabbinic tradition, especially in the Kabbalistic tradition and in the Hasidic tradition afterwards, understood that verse. On the contrary, they understood that Abraham is worthy of being given chesed from God, loving kindness from God, because Abraham was such an exemplar of chesed in his life. Likewise, Jacob would be an appropriate beneficiary of truth from God, because Jacob was such an exemplar of the value of truth in his life. Now, what we tried to do last week was perhaps to unpack through a midrashic lens a way of understanding the deeper relationship between Jacob and truth that perhaps isn't undermined, if anything, is perhaps accentuated by his involvement in these scenes of deception in last week's Parashah. For example, and in fact, what we looked at in depth was the idea that there are some sorts of disguises that can help to reveal a deeper truth. By wearing the disguise, you end up revealing a deeper truth. Isaac's face, we learned, was a disguise, because Isaac's face was made to look more like his father Abraham than it was naturally going to look, in order to communicate a deeper truth to the world, that Isaac was indeed the son of Abraham, despite the doubts and despite the rumors to the contrary. Using that midrashic trope, we suggested, well, perhaps when Jacob dons the clothes of Esau, he helps to reveal both to himself, his mother helps to reveal to him by putting this costume upon him, and he helps to reveal to his father by going through with this ruse, that he has more gumption, more chutzpah, more audacity than Isaac ever thought he had. And therefore, by wearing this costume, which Isaac saw through on our reading last week, he helped to communicate a truth. And therefore, we came up with this idea of falsehood in the service of truth, a deception in the service of truth. But there is also the suggestion that it didn't come naturally to Jacob to act in this way, because he was, as his father suspected, a little bit of an introvert. He was the tent-dwelling, quiet brother compared to the extroverted, outdoorsy, hunty brother of Esau. Now, one episode in last week's Parashah that I didn't investigate with you, but it really came to me as I helped to explain the episode to my 8-year-old son. We were talking about it over the Shabbat table. What about the sale of the birthright? Wasn't that a bit tricky of Jacob to manipulate Esau when he was in his weak moment and he was tired and he was hungry, and all of a sudden, oh, I'll give you this yummy soup, but only if you'll sell your birthright. Well, actually, that initiative came from Jacob himself. It wasn't from his mother. But perhaps a similar theme could be read into that episode. Jacob offering Esau this bribe actually revealed a truth about Esau that wasn't readily apparent beforehand. In fact, the narrative says straight after, it says Esau disdained, he was mavazer. I don't know a better way of translating that word. He disdained his birthright. Esau disdained his birthright. You ask, why did the narrator have to go out of his way to say Esau disdained his birthright? We just read the story, right? We know what happened. Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of lentils, right? Clearly he disdained his birthright. Why did that need to be said? Well, perhaps it needed to be said because that was the truth that Jacob unveiled. You know, Esau, he cries a lot in the end of the Parashah when he doesn't get his blessings. But let us not forget that, you know, he said, oh, I'm going to die of hunger. I know hunger's a bad thing, but really, I mean, he sold his birthright for a bowl of lentils. And what Jacob did was to reveal an underlying truth. Now, we're moving into Parashat Vayetze. And what I'm hoping to do over this week and next week is to sketch a continuing evolution of Jacob that has a lot to do with his being a deeply ideological and truthful person. So at the beginning of this week's Parashah, Jacob has his famous dream, right? He had a dream, a ladder was set onto the ground, its top reached to the skies, and you've got angels, and here, be careful to note the order. You've got angels going up and down on the ladder. Okay. In the continuation of the dream, God stands over Jacob and he tells him all sorts of very seemingly reassuring things. He says things like, the ground on which you're lying, I will grant to you and your offspring will be numerous. All the families of the earth will be blessed through you and your descendants. God says to Jacob in this dream, I'll protect you wherever you go. When Jacob wakes up, it says he was afraid. And then he says, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the abode of God, and this is the gateway to heaven. The verb that describes God as, sorry, not God, the verse that describes Jacob as afraid, vayira, and the adjective that Jacob uses to, sorry, not the verse that describes Jacob as afraid, the verb that describes Jacob as afraid, vayira, and Jacob was afraid. And the adjective that Jacob uses to describe the location of his dream, Norah, awesome, they share a root. Accordingly, you don't have to read it that Jacob was actually afraid so much as awestruck, right? Nevertheless, I do think there's a possibility of reading it that he was afraid. Jacob was afraid, and then he says, how awesome is this place? In fact, many of the standard English translations translate it just like that. Jacob woke up and he was afraid, and he says, how awesome is this place? And I told you to pay attention to the imagery of the dream, because you might expect that angels, there's a ladder from heaven, like a portal from another dimension. You might imagine seeing the angels coming down first, because they live in heaven, and they come down to earth, and then they go back up. That might be the natural order, but that's not what happened, right? These angels ascend the ladder, and only then do they come down. So where do they come from? Why do they go back down the ladder after they've gone up a bit, right? After they've returned to heaven. And there are all sorts of midrashic explanations of this. Perhaps the team of angels which accompanied Jacob in Israel is being replaced by a different team of angels that are going to accompany him in the diaspora. So one set of angels goes up, his Israel angels, and then another set of angels comes down, his diaspora angels. And this becomes like a pit stop, an angelic pit stop, you know, when the Formula One drivers pull in and they get their tires done and their gas changed. So this is an angelic pit stop. Although the implication of the verse is it's the same angels going down as the angels going up. So it's not perhaps the most convincing of midrashic explanations. So I want to share with you another midrash. And this is the first midrash on our handout. Okay, it's from the Midrash Tanchuma, a medieval collection with much older midrashim. We say medieval because the first people to cite it were medieval. Rashi cites it quite extensively. I'm just getting the handout on my screen in a way that I can see you and it. Okay, good. Here we are. Says the Midrash, Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman. Samuel, son of Nachman, said, Elu sarei umot ha'olam. If you want to know who these angels are, I'll tell you. They are the ministering angels of the nations of the world. The Amar Shmuel bar Nachman, that which Samuel bar Nachman said teaches us something. Melamed, it teaches us something. Shehera alo HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'avinu Yaakov Sarah shel Bavel ola shiv'im ukim v'yored. What did the Holy One, blessed be He, show Jacob? He showed him the ministering angel of Babylon climbing 70 rungs of this ladder towards the heavens, and then he descended. And then he saw B'Shel Madai, Chamishim Ushnayim v'yored. And he saw the ministering angel of Media ascend on the ladder 52 rungs and then descend. B'Shel Yavan Me'ah v'yored. And then Jacob saw the ministering angel of Greece ascend 100 rungs on the ladder and then descend. B'Shel Edom. And then the angel of Edom. Edom is the angel of, well, Edom is another name for Esav. In fact, we learned that last week when Esav drank the red stew that Jacob gave him. He got the name Red as a nickname. Eddie Reddy, Eddie, Edom, and that's his nickname. But the Edomites are a nation. Now, in the rabbinic imagination, and I don't think there's much evidence for this in terms of any type of ancient historiography or ancient history, but in the rabbinic imagination, Edom becomes the nation of Rome. Okay, so Edom stands for the Romans. The great symbol of Edom is the eagle, like the imperial eagle of Rome. So Jacob, after seeing the angel of Bavel ascend and descend, and the angel of Midia ascend and descend, and after seeing the angel of Greece ascend and descend, he sees the angel of Rome. And you have to know, I'll mention this again when it becomes relevant, but this midrash was written in the time or in the wake of the Roman persecution of the rabbis. And the rabbis look at the galut, this exile that lasted 2,000 years and still isn't over for many of us, although I'm speaking from the comfort of the land of Israel. But the exile through the diaspora for 2,000 years and more, the rabbis related to it as the Roman exile, because the Romans were the ones that precipitated this, even after the fall of Rome, right? So in the rabbinic imagination, the Holy Roman Empire, the great powers of Europe, perhaps even the great nation of the United States of America represent somehow the powers of Edom. There is also an eagle in the American seal, I believe. So he sees the angel of Edom rising. V'lo yada kama. But Jacob couldn't figure out how many rungs he'd risen. The ascent seemed like it was never ending. But ota sha'a nitjara Yaakov Avinu va'amar. At that moment, Jacob was scared, and he said, "Shema lazeh ein lo yirida." Maybe this angel will never come down. This Roman power that subjugates the Jews and kept them out of the land of Israel, maybe it doesn't have a descent. Amalok Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One blessed be, he said to him, Va'ata, you, al tira avdi Yaakov al techat Yisrael, the verse from Jeremiah, don't fear my servant Jacob, and don't worry Israel. Kivyachol, as if to say, Afilu ata ro'eh ole etzli. Sorry, ro'ehu ole etzli. Even if you see him, this ministering angel of Rome, rise all the way up to me on this ladder, says God. Misham ani morido. I will take him down from there. Shneimar, as it says, and this is a verse from the book of Obadiah, a one-chapter book in the 12 minor prophets, that is entirely dedicated to the downfall of Edom. It says, Im tagbia kanesha, right? Should you rise, or should you rise like an eagle? The in bein kochavim simkinecha, and even if you place your nest between the stars, misham oridcha num Hashem, from there I will take you down, says the Lord God, says God. Okay, so what's going on in this midrash? Well, first of all, notice that our midrash echoes the words of the Parashah, because it says Jacob was afraid and he said. In the Parashah it says Jacob was afraid and he said, how awesome is this place. In the midrash, Jacob was afraid and he said, maybe this one has no descent, right? But Jacob was afraid and he said is a phrase that in the biblical narrative, those words occur after Jacob awakes. But in the midrash, those words get swallowed up into the dream itself. Jacob had, according to the rabbis, seen something scary. He had seen the rise of 4 great empires that would seek to destroy the Jewish people. And this explains why the angels start on the ground, right? They were symbolizing the rise of these civilizations, the rise and fall of civilizations. The empire that had ruled over Rav Shmuel, the author of our Midrash, as I said, was Rome, and that was an empire that in the eyes of the rabbis just seemed to rise and rise. Right? It was the empire that destroyed the Second Temple. It was the empire that persecuted the Jews. And you might legitimately fear, would they ever fall? Would the oppression ever cease? Now, earlier in the book of Genesis, Hashem had made a very strange covenant with Abraham. It's called the covenant between the parts, or the Brit Bein Tarim, where Abraham is told to gather these dead animals, and he cuts them in half, and then he has this image, and a fire moves between them, right? In that covenant, Abraham was promised a large nation, he was promised a land, and he was promised more, but he was also told explicitly in the biblical account of that prophecy, that in the process of sealing that covenant, Abraham was given a terrifying glimpse of the national tragedies that would befall his people before they received the full promise of the covenant. Namely, he foresees the slavery in Egypt. And though the words of the prophecy that Abraham receives in the covenant between the parts are in places comforting, before the words speak to Abraham, a great dread and darkness fall upon him. Accordingly, the rabbis here imagine that in a similar vein, the promises in Jacob's dream must have come along, as they did with Abraham's promises, with some sort of terrifying vision of the bad times that would befall us first. So what's happening in this Midrash, right? The Midrash is doing a lot of work here. The Midrash is linking Jacob's dream to Abraham's vision. It's explaining why these angels start on the ground before descending. And it explains why Jacob's sense of awe was like Abraham's, tinged with a residue of fear, right? But then the Midrash continues. I've cut a little bit of the Midrash to skip to the part I'm interested in. But in its continuation, it asks what I take to be a really charming question, which is, why didn't Jacob, in the dream, try to climb the ladder? Like, you've got a ladder going up to heaven, right? It's heaven. So, at least as far as the rabbis were concerned, this is a question. And in one particularly harsh midrash, the question turns into a rebuke. Rabbi Shmuel ben Yosina Hayadoresh, Rabbi Samuel, son of Yosina, used to expound upon the verse in Psalms. The verse that says, "B'chol zot chatu od v'lo ha'eminu b'nifla'otav." The verse says, nevertheless, they, the Jewish people, continued to sin and didn't have faith in God's wonders. And when Rabbi Shmuel ben Yosina expounded that verse from Psalms, he said it was a comment about Jacob. How so? Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Jacob during the dream, Ilu alita vehe'emanta, had you climbed the ladder and had faith, lo haita lacha yarida lo'olam, you would have no descent. You would be the one exception to the rule of history in which civilizations rise and then fall. Yours would have been an ascent without descent. Ella, hoil v'lo he'emanta. But since you didn't have faith, meaning because you didn't climb the ladder, you just stood by and watched it, Harei vanecha mishta'abdin bahalalu arba malchiyot ba'olam hazeh. Your progeny, before they rise to their full height, will first of all be subjugated by the 4 empires you saw rising and falling: the Babylonians, the Medians, the Greeks, and the Romans. How will they be subjugated? B'misim, uva'anoniot, uva'gudaliot, through taxes, oppression, although arnona in modern Hebrew is council tax, right? But it's a different sort of tax, right? But through taxes, oppression, and exiles. It's pretty harsh. So to unpack the Midrash, Jacob was presented in his dream with a singular opportunity, a ladder straight up to heaven. That's how Shmuel Bar Yosina is looking at it. He's looking at the ladder as an opportunity to reach God. But in the language of the Psalms, he nevertheless continued to sin. And what was his sin? His sin was not to climb the ladder, not to seize the opportunity. His failure to climb was sinful because it reflected a lack of, and here again, a quote from the Psalms, a lack of faith in God's wonders. Now, this takes us back to last week, because last week I suggested that Yitzchak had his doubts about Yaakov, right? Yaakov was a mild-mannered young man who was pure of heart. These are wonderful qualities, right? But did he have what it takes to lead a people? Would his purity be his undoing? Because the ladder in this dream, according to this Midrash, it represents, pretty explicitly, as far as the Midrash is concerned, it represents the world of politics and statecraft, the rise and fall of nations, geopolitics. Okay. And Jacob sees every nation try to rise up, and he also sees every nation fall. So he'd rather stay. This sounds like a setup, like in the Gan Eden, right? He was destined to fail. Yeah, perhaps. Although part of what's really nice about the Jacob story through the thread of midrashim that I'm isolating this week and last week and hopefully next week is Jacob overcomes many of these obstacles and he grows. So this is where he stands this week, right? He's failing. He sees every nation try to rise up, sees every nation fall, and he'd rather stay, so to speak, with his untainted purity on the ground. But we're told by the Midrash that constitutes a lack of faith, right? A lack of faith in God's wonders. Now, Drisha is not only non-denominational or post-denominational, it's also not party political in any way, and I don't want to change that. But speaking in a personal capacity, I think of this Midrash when I consider the reaction of ultra-Orthodox Judaism to the project of Zionism, because there is a pious mindset, and it truly is pious, that wants no part in statecraft or in the stench that it leaves on one's hands, right? But then I would respond, or the Midrash would respond. If there's a ladder to the heavens in front of you, right, should a fear of falling, a fear of getting your hands dirty, or perhaps an ideological purity stop you from trying to ascend, right? What we're going to discuss next week is that, and this is part of what Yaakov has to learn and does learn. What we're going to learn next week is that sometimes we are required to get our hands dirty. Sometimes doing the right thing can leave something of a taint behind. There can sometimes be a purity in inaction, and and an impurity in action, but that doesn't necessarily absolve you of the responsibility to act, even though so acting will inevitably stain one's hands, right? The right thing to do is sometimes damaging to our purity. And that, right, on this midrash is why Jacob wakes up afraid. Right? He knows that he's been promised wonderful things. He also knows that there's a long journey ahead, that other nations will rise and fall before we learn that we have to take the opportunities that come our way. And perhaps he remains afraid of our getting our hands dirty too, as we climb up the greasy pole of I can't remember who it was. I think it was a British Prime Minister who called power a greasy pole, right? Jacob was reluctant to deceive his father last week, right? His mother had to prod him. And according to our midrash, he was reluctant in this dream too. But then the question is, right, what if Yitzchak had chosen Esav? So personally, I would rather have a leader whose integrity renders him or her reluctant to climb that greasy pole of power, than a leader who just revels in the grease, right? I would rather, and again, speaking in a totally personal capacity, I think we're a long way from this, but I would rather a Zionism that is aware of the stench that comes with statecraft, right? And tries its hardest to climb the ladder with that recognition in mind. That's to say, a Zionism that recognizes that it inevitably does harm when it tries to translate its dream into a reality, but that seeks to ameliorate the harm that politics almost inevitably creates, without, on the one hand, abandoning the project altogether, or on the other hand, perhaps reveling in the power and the glory that intoxicated Bavel and Media and Greece and Rome, right? You don't have to look deep into Israeli history to see how power tends to come with corruption, right? So Yaakov was right to be afraid. And even the ultra-Orthodox communities that held out against Zionism because of an ideological purity, look, they eventually ended up on the whole embracing the project, even if half-heartedly, right? And what one might say, in a personal capacity, is that their political leaders soil their hands every day in the grease of corruption, just as often as anyone else does, right? In what is really a quite dirty political field in Israel. But the question is, does political involvement have to come at such a cost? Does the desire for sovereignty have to come with militarism? Does the desire for self-determination have to come along with xenophobia, right? And these things should leave us scared. But that also doesn't mean we should abandon the ladder to heaven, right? That we should give up on our dreams, sacrifice our rights. Instead, we tread, but we tread carefully. So I'm going to take us on a little detour through next week's Parashah in a minute. But before I do, to summarize the point I'm making is that, yes, as Alana Lubin said in the text box, it looks like a test that Jacob was bound to fail. But I think Esav would have passed this test so quickly as to be worrying. That's to say this shouldn't be an easy test. If you find this test easy, then perhaps your soul isn't sensitive to the inevitable impurity of getting involved in statecraft and leadership and government. And I would rather have someone who struggles with this than someone who finds it all too easy. Before I go into a detour into next week's Parashah, I'll say, for me, and this is like Sam Lebens' Midrash on the Midrash, what I've told you up until now, I really think in a sense is the Pshat of the Midrash. I think the Midrash is a Midrash about geopolitics, the rise and fall of nations. It is a Midrash about Jacob's fears of getting involved in that process. And I think that the Midrash was answering the questions that I raised. What is Jacob afraid of? Why are the angels going up first and down second? I think there's a clever intertextuality that tries to make Jacob's prophecy at least a little bit more like Abraham's prophecy. All of that, I don't think that's Sam Lebens doing Midrash on the Midrash. I really think that's a pretty accurate unpacking of what's going on in the Midrash. But personally, when I look at this Midrash, I think of the ladder, I kind of transpose it into a different key and make it a story not just about statecraft, but also about organized religion. Because I personally have had the honor to know a number of really saintly people from more than one religion. I was just, in fact, didn't I give this talk from Lisbon a couple of weeks ago? I think I spoke to you from Lisbon. When I did, I was at an interfaith conference of philosophers, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish. There's one Muslim guy there, Pakistani Muslim who grew up in England, and he's an academic philosopher and religious Muslim in Turkey these days. And he had such a holiness about him that I don't think one tends to see in people who are secular through and through. You find tremendously wonderful, righteous, upright, decent, good secular people. I'm not denying that for a moment. There was a certain kind of piety that's characteristic of religiosity, but religiosity done right. And I was like, wow, that's a holy person. And I think people had that sense when they met, Rav Avraham Yoshua Heschel. It's an amazing clip online of some monks who had prayed together with Heschel, 40 or 50 years before the video was taken of them. And they were crying just in the recollection of being in his presence. And, I felt that when I was in the presence of some of my great teachers, whether it was Rabbi Jonathan Sachs or Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, you sometimes felt you were just in the presence of somebody who had been touched by godliness. So I've been lucky enough to see how lived religion can have a transformative power and create kind of saintliness. Right? So you can think of religion as a ladder that can take people all the way to heaven. Right? And then it brings something of heaven back down to earth again. Once these great people have been touched by religiosity. But much more often than that, I'm afraid to say, we see people in the name of religion doing terrible things. People posing as religious leaders, people occupying positions of religious authority, only to abuse the power and to leave devastation or heartbreak, pain in their wake. Right? And all of this, I think, could leave a pure-hearted person to despair of religion. In fact, I'm speaking biographically because I have a 14-year-old son at home who's been through the religious schooling in Israel and is very, very put off because he says, well, how can this be like a decent thing if so many of the practitioners of this thing called Judaism are racist or sexist or homophobic? Right. So when I read this midrash, I have Jacob seeing a ladder, and that ladder could signify religion. And Jacob, because of his own purity, he doesn't want to engage with it, like my son. He sees how corrosive it can be. He sees angels rise, or they certainly look like angels as they rose. But then he sees them fall when it inevitably turns out there's this sex scandal, or there's a racism that you discover, or there's a whatever. And yet, at the end of the day, like Jacob, we do still have a ladder before us. And despite its having its feet in the earth, right, religion really can lead a person to heaven, so long as they have, so to speak, to echo the verse in the Psalm, so long as they have faith in the wonders of God. And we're called upon to climb, even if, more often than not, it fails. That's quite a sad place to end, but we're not ending. I want to go on a detour through the next week's Parashah, because I want to show, and we're going to look at this much more in depth, but I thought I'd give you a taste of what's to come. I think, and I hope to flesh this out much more next week, but I think we end up with a Yaakov who is transformed when he returns to Israel during next week's Parashah, after his multiple years living in Padam Aram with his uncle Laban, and he gets married to Leah and then Rachel. He's the victim of trickery himself in being married unwittingly to the wrong woman, so to speak. When he returns to Israel, and I said I'm not going to get too deeply into it. One thing you can notice is he commands angels, right? In Parashat Vayishlach, right? So it's not the Parashah coming, but the one after, when he returns to Israel, he sends angels to Esav to begin the process of reconciliation. Now, you could pick me up at this point and say, no, it's just messengers, because the Hebrew word malach means messengers. But at the very end of Parashat Vayetze, this week's Parashah, Yaakov sees a camp of angels, and he calls the place Machanayim. It's this kind of mystical vision he has. And it's directly after seeing these heavenly angels that he sends messengers to Esav. So it's not a gigantic leap to suggest that the messengers he sends are among the angels that he saw in Machanayim, right? Which is what the rabbis indeed do say in various midrashim. So now compare and contrast Jacob in his dream by the ladder at the beginning of this week's Parashah, and Jacob's activity at the beginning of the week after. In the dream, as the rabbis read it, as we've seen in our Midrash in Parashat Tanchuma, Jacob is lamentably passive. And he's passive because of a fear, perhaps a fear of getting his hands dirty. So he sees angels, but he doesn't engage. At the very beginning of next week's Parashah, he's in charge of the angels. He's sending them left, right, and center. He's a different man. Okay. We'll talk more about that transformation next week, but there's one other place we see it manifest. And I think there's a great deal of beauty about it, right? And this is the second source on the handout, Bereshit Rabbah 76:2. In Parashat Vayishlach, when Jacob hears that his brother, of whom he last heard in a fratricidal rage, right? His brother wanted to kill him. It's the last time he heard of his brother. And he hears that his brother is coming with 300 men to greet him. He's a little bit perturbed. And the verse says, Vayira Yaakov mo'od vayetzer lo. Jacob was very afraid and he was distressed. Now, Jacob afraid, that's a Jacob we know. Jacob was afraid when he woke up with his dream in the ladder. But the question is, what's the difference? Because the 5 books of Moses are not known for being liberal with adjectives or adverbs or even verbs. It's not known for being liberal in its descriptions of anything, especially internal states of protagonists. And here we have 2 verbs, two descriptions of Jacob, verbal roots, right? It's fear and distress. And the rabbis were interested in that, this profusion of descriptions of Yaakov's internal state. Amar Rabbi Yehuda b'Rabbi Eli. This is, as I said, Midrash Bereshit Rabbah. Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Eli, said, Lohi Yira, Lohi Tzara. Are these not the same thing? Or if there is a difference between fear and distress, are they not functionally close enough that the Torah had to give us both of them? Because knowing that the Torah is not liberal with its descriptions, okay, we could go through a whole list of differences between fear and distress, but are they so far apart that the Bible needed both of them when the Bible barely, it doesn't like to waste ink? Ella, says Yehuda Rabbi Eli, Rabbi Yehuda, son of Eli, he says, no, the Bible's trying to tell something very important here. Vayirah, he was scared. Shelo yaharog, he didn't want to be killed. V'yetzer lo shelo yehareg, but he was also distressed. He didn't want to have to kill. Amar, he said, Im hu mitgaber elai, if he overpowers me, horgeni, I'm going to be killed. That's enough for one verb of fear, distress. Ve'im ani mitgaber alav, but if I overpower him, ani hogo, I'll kill him. And that's another reason to be distressed. Hadahu, that's why it says Vayira, he was afraid, Shelo Yaharog, Vayetzer lo Shelo Yehareg. He both didn't want to kill and he didn't want to be killed. Now, if you pay attention, and we'll pay more attention to this next week, if Jacob had to kill in this instance, it would have been killing in self-defense. And in Judeo ethics, to kill in self-defense is not a crime, as long as the force is proportionate, right? If you could maim an assailant and thereby save your life or the life of those at risk, then that would be preferable. But if you end up killing an assailant in a proportionate way in order to save the lives of innocent others or oneself, it's actually a mitzvah. It's seen to be a good deed. So why would that distress Yaakov? Right now, as I understand it, this is the triumph of Yaakov. This is where Yaakov passes the test that he wasn't yet passing when he saw the ladder. He is no longer the young man who would, by nature, refuse to get his hands dirty in order to do the right thing. Jewish law mandates us to kill in self-defense. And if Yaakov had to kill Esav to save his own life or the life of others, then he would have fulfilled a religious obligation, and he was willing to do so. But the point is, not every religious obligation is one that we should enjoy. Yaakov will act, but the prospect of such an action distresses him nevertheless, right? This is a Yaakov who Yaakov was always aware that doing the right thing in an imperfect world can leave you tainted, right? And in fact, he suffers, and we'll look at next week and we'll delineate them. He suffers multiple consequences from his own act of deceiving his father. It was that one act which rendered him homeless. He had to leave home. It was that one act that served as the quote unquote justification for his being tricked into marrying Leah before Rachel. So he had suffered the consequences of deceiving his father, even though that deception was in that instance, as we've discussed last week, the only way to communicate a deeper truth to his father. We've seen this week that he was too afraid of getting his hands dirty to climb a ladder to the heavens. But what we see next week is a Yaakov who's grown up. And what we now have is three midrashic models, if you like. But I think they're rooted in the text of the story of the Bible. So on the one hand, you have the young Yaakov, and his purity renders him almost unable to act. He only ever does anything when he's prodded by others, right? So he deceives his father to get the bechorot, the bechira, the right of the firstborn, which he anyway was owed because he'd already bought it from Esau. But he had to deceive his father to get what was, so to speak, rightfully his, and that wasn't his initiative. His mother pushed him into it. Then he comes to the home of God, right? Beit El, quite literally the home of God, and he sees a ladder climbing to the heavens, and he's too scared to climb it, and that's right, because young Yaakov is truth in its purity, that doesn't want to be sullied by falsehood and stains and the taint. It's the piety of the people who don't get involved in history. Then you have, right, so that's character number one, young Yaakov. Then you have the Esavs of this world who just don't see moral complexity, right? They do what they think is right in any given time. They don't pay heed to the stains that gather on their soul or to the fraying of their moral fiber. And you can see why Yitzchak, if he was faced with the choice of Yaakov or Esav, may have favored Esav, because they're both pretty bad. But in the end of the day, Esav at least will get something done, right? And there are things to do in this world. But then you have what Yaakov's going to become. And that is a Yaakov who understands the damage that doing the right thing can do, so much so that it distresses him, but it doesn't paralyze him. And it's only such a character, I think, who's really, truly worthy of leadership, because it's only a person like that who ultimately will have the sensitivity to ameliorate the negative consequences that stem from his right actions. How often do we see, and again, I'm speaking in a personal capacity, but how often do you see in the Middle East people on both sides saying, oh, well, why should we care about, those bad consequences that befell so-and-so? So, we did the right thing, so who cares what the costs were for other people? Well, no, even if you did do the right thing, of course, if you did the wrong thing, you owe people compensation. And who can say we haven't, who can say that we've only done the right things in history? But even when you do the right things, there can sometimes be a human cost. And only people who are sensitive to that will have the, I suppose, ethical imagination to try to ameliorate the negative consequences of even the good things they've done. Only a character like that, a Yaakov like that, can have, and here we'll borrow an image from next week's Parashah, the audacity to wrestle with an ethical dilemma, because Yaakov wrestles and he refuses to let it go. He will limp on and on until somehow the wrestling with an ethical dilemma leaves him blessed, right? So what I'm trying to do over these Yaakov weeks is to sketch a picture where it no longer seems so absurd to say that the unifying theme of the entire life of Jacob is truth. It's truth that leads him to a natural disposition of quietism, a natural disposition not to act, because as soon as you act in this world of deceit, you get your hands sullied. It's truth that gives him that natural disposition. It was truth that motivated the deception he got involved with last week. It was truth that led him to be too afraid to climb the ladder that he dreamt of this week. And it was that character trait that perhaps caused Yitzchak to favor Esav over Yaakov. And what we're going to see next week is how Yaakov eventually manages to become an exemplar of truth in a world of deceit. He eventually manages to become a person who stands for truth and ideological purity in a world of action, where compromise is always required, where ethical dilemmas are the name of the game. All right. Any questions, comments, objections?
It was fantastic as always, and I
Thank
just
you.
wish we could continue beyond next week or follow you where you just have a wonderful way of analyzing and with just
Thank you, Jennifer.
thank
Yeah,
you so
so,
much.
You know what, especially in the Yaakov weeks, what we're trying to do is, and I said earlier on, sometimes we'd look at midrashim that are kind of isolated. They have a message they want to explore and they kind of hang it onto a verse. But there are other midrashim which often you can find them, they become a family that have a story to tell about what's really going on in the narrative. And we're so familiar with midrashic flights of fancy that we sometimes don't realize that even in the midst of their flights of fancy, they very often get to the heart of what a story is all about. You know, and I don't know what the angel symbolized on the ladder. And, you know, it's fanciful to say that it was Babylon and Media and Greece. And yet I do think there is an evolution in the life of Jacob that one can trace out in the biblical verses themselves, that these midrashic fan fiction help you to see. You wouldn't see them without it. So I appreciate that you appreciate it, Jennifer. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Oh, go ahead then. Yeah.
No, go on.
I just wondered, perhaps I missed it. Was there a defining event that then, I'll be so embarrassed, it was huge and I missed it and you said it, they kicked Jacob over into being willing to get his hands dirty?
Well, that's what we have to look at. That's what we have to look into. And that's what happens in between this week's Parashah and next week. In a nutshell, it has to do with his interactions with this shady character called Lavan, which must be a very funny name, because his name means white, whiter than white.
Oh,
you know?
yes.
Is the guy who's absolutely upright. No stains on him, and yet he's a tricky character. Is Lavan, and I think it's Yaakov's interactions with Lavan that leave him a changed man. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
We'll see. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Lebens, as always, for a wonderful, enlightening class, and for everyone here for your participation in our learning community, including folks on Facebook. I see you there. I know that you are participating in your own way. We, of course, have lots of learning coming up this week at Drisha. In particular, I would like to point out things that are starting this week, being Rabbi Silber's new class on Eliyahu in the Talmud, which will be happening on Thursdays at 1 p.m. Eastern. So we've had a number of classes over the past few terms dealing with Prophet Elijah, and we're continuing. I guess we're going to become experts. So that's something I look forward to. And I look forward to learning with you all again soon. Be well.